So good morning. If people can take their seats, we're going to get started. I'm Jennifer March. I'm the Executive Director of Citizens Committee for Children, and I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. I'm especially grateful that we're all gathered in person together. As you know, CCC is a New York City-based nonprofit, nonpartisan child advocacy organization whose mission is to ensure that every child is healthy, housed, educated, and safe. And among the things we do, we conduct quantitative and qualitative research that helps us understand what life is like for New York City's 1.7 million children. We analyze budgets and legislation and public policies. We engage adult and youth New Yorkers in advocacy training, and we collaborate with all of you, our direct service colleagues, and our colleagues in local government to make New York City a better place for all children. We have a long-standing tradition of leveraging data to advocate for change in New York City, and this year is no exception. We've come together this morning at a critical juncture. We have new leadership in the city administration, the city council, and citywide and borough-wide elected offices. And these new leaders are going to help to inform how New York City's children, families, and communities recover from the COVID-19 pandemic. And as Mayor Adams and the City Council carry out negotiations for their very first budget, we have an important opportunity to reflect on where progress had been made in this past, where pandemic impacts have been particularly heartfelt, and where action is needed to create a more equitable city. Today, we're unveiling details of our new data book, keeping track of New York City's children, and we hope that this will be an important resource for our collective efforts, work with direct service, community organizers, philanthropy, government, and New Yorkers at large. The 2022 edition actually marks the 30th year we've been engaged in collecting and analyzing data from local government sources. And we've come to think of keeping track as the desk reference to the hundreds of indicators on child and family well-being that we make available to the public free of charge at www.data.cccnewyork.org. We developed this new edition, which focuses on pandemic impacts and recovery, with the aim of illustrating the breadth and depth of impact of the pandemic and how it has impacted children, families, and communities across the city. And it's our hope that we can leverage the data presented in this edition to ensure that the needs of children, families, and communities remain front and center in decisions being made here locally in the city budget process, as well as our ongoing collective efforts to inform recovery at every level of government. Today, we have an opportunity to hear from several leaders within the City Council who are joining us to discuss both the reactions to the executive budget that was released last week and to share their top priorities as budget negotiations advance in New York City. But before we turn to them, I'm really pleased to introduce to you Bijan Kimiagar, CCC's Associate Executive Director for Research. Bijan will provide a very brief overview of key findings from the data book. And while he makes his way up here, I also would like to acknowledge Maria Dubrovnik, who is our Senior Research Associate for Data Resources, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, but was instrumental in putting this data book together. So please help me in welcoming Bijan to the podium.
Morning.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's with great pleasure and appreciation for all of my colleagues at CCC that I share with you the newest edition of our data book. The data book is a key component of our advocacy to make sure that families have healthy, housed, educated, and safe. We have more than 1.7 million children in New York City. It represents the largest child population in the country. The city's child population is incredibly diverse. 1 in 12 is born outside of the United States. Half has at least one immigrant parent. Nearly half of children live in a household that's headed by a single parent, grandparent, foster parent, or other relative. The racial, ethnic, and linguistic diversity of the city is apparent in the child population. However, patterns of segregation persist in our communities, in our schools, and other settings of children's lives. For this reason, we produced a keeping track of the city's children's data book and have over the last 4 decades to present the facts, shed light on progress, gaps, and inequities stemming from structural discrimination, and demonstrate the importance of public policy, budget decisions on the lives and well-being of New York City's children and families. Data that we analyze and report in the book comes from dozens of government sources, including the U.S. Census Bureau, as well as New York State, New York City agencies, either through public data portals or through our requests to agencies for unpublished data. The Keeping Track Data Book strives to include the most up-to-date and detailed information on New York City's children. However, the COVID-19 pandemic raised immense challenges in both data collection and reporting. It required innovation and new tools for gathering information to accurately capture this tumultuous period. To paraphrase the U.S. Census Bureau, coronavirus infected data too. To adapt to these challenges, the Census Bureau made 2 notable changes to its suite of surveys. First, to address the lower response rate to the 2020 American Community Survey, the Bureau introduced a unique weighting methodology different from previous years. These estimates are qualified as experimental, which should not be compared to previous years of data. We make note of this in our data. Secondly, an opportunity. In April of 2020, the Census Bureau launched an experimental product called the Household Pulse Survey to monitor the impacts of COVID-19 on the well-being of households across the United States. We at CCC utilized the New York State Metropolitan Statistical Area. By combining both new and existing sources of data, this book offers the most comprehensive account on the lives of New York City's children and families prior to and during the COVID-19 pandemic. In each chapter, we spotlight data to understand both where we come from and where we are in order to inform where we want to go. The book provides demographic information about our city's children, as well as the facts about their economic security, housing security, health and mental health, educational opportunities, and data specific to youth, context of family and community. We provide data at community level for zip codes, school districts, and offer geographic profiles for each of the 59 community districts, 5 boroughs in New York City as a whole. What I'd like to do now is provide more information on loss, disruptions to family services, and stressors to well-being that families experience during the pandemic, but put in context of conditions prior to the pandemic. Through our analysis of data prior to the pandemic, we identify several areas of welcome progress in child and family well-being, including lower poverty rates, greater access to early education, and fewer children in foster care. But for the sake of time, I'd like to focus on a few examples narrowly in order to inform a roadmap to a more equitable city in the future. So from 2010 to 2019, New York City recovered from the Great Recession. We saw consistent growth in median income among families with children. Yet extreme income inequality continued over this period, reproducing high poverty rates, particularly for children of color and households headed by a single mother. When we think about these data from just prior to the pandemic, in the context of the unprecedented spike in unemployment and income losses, we are very concerned about further threats to racial and gender-based workforce equity, especially when we know women with children report higher rates of being out of work and are more likely to cite lack of childcare as the primary barrier to employment. We know from data from the Household Pulse survey that 1 in 2 households with children reported difficulty meeting their weekly expenses. 1 in 3 renter households with children reported being behind on rental payments. And 1 in 7 households with children reported sometimes or often not having enough. These conditions affected young people's opportunities and challenges in profound ways. 1 in 10 households with children reported 0 days of live contact with teachers over the average week. And 1 in 2 youth ages 18 to 24 reported symptoms of anxiety and depression. Perhaps most significantly and tragically, the pandemic resulted in widespread illness and loss of life, with disproportionate rates of hospitalization and death among people. Our own analysis of census data and data from the City Department of Health, we estimate that 4,730 children experienced the loss of a parent. Children's behavioral health services were already in short supply prior to the pandemic, and advocates including CCC have been working in coalition to increase investments before and especially during the pandemic to support children who experience profound loss. Putting context to what was happening prior to the pandemic, we were already concerned about the growing mental health crisis among young people. High school age youth were increasingly reporting symptoms of depression, particularly among female youth and lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth. Among the adult population, 18 and older, national estimates of symptoms of anxiety or depression increased threefold from 2019 to 2020. Locally, outreach to New York City Well mental health hotline increased dramatically during school. In another example, we know that prior to disruption during the pandemic, there was historic growth in the reach of early education programming and after school and summer programs. And our task moving forward is to ensure families have increased access to these critical programs. In a final example, we know that the number of families with children in shelter was declining prior to the pandemic, and with a steep decline during the pandemic. While the average length of stay for these families was already over a year prior to the pandemic, finding housing for those who remained in shelter has been even more challenging during the pandemic, and thus the average length of stay for families with children in shelter jumped to 520 days. It is also important to frame this housing security crisis as another policy area that demands actions to achieve both racial and gender justice, because we know that 94% of heads of households of families with children in shelter are Black or Hispanic, in the vast majority of women and children. So in sharing these examples of progress and setbacks, we are telling a story of how to build a more resilient city. The concept of resilience acknowledges the scars of trauma as reminders of where we have been, what we have been through, and that we are in fact a new version of ourselves. At CCC, the new version of New York that we envision is one that invests in families as a key strategy to continue weathering the current crisis and prepare for others in the future. We know that when federal, state, and local governments invest in families, these investments make a huge difference for families and for society as a whole. For example, in 2021, the temporary expansion of the federal child tax credit provided critical relief to millions of families. In New York State alone, there were more than 3 million children benefiting from this policy. These payments, we know, went towards clothing, school supplies, utilities, and contributed to significant reductions in food and rental insecurity. The temporary expansion was part of the American Rescue Plan. However, Congress has yet to extend or make the expansion permanent. So we should not expect to see similar increased economic security without ongoing initiatives. Looking at 2 other examples, New York State established a moratorium on evictions at the onset of the pandemic, which prevented even greater housing insecurity. However, since then, 115,000 eviction filings have been submitted to housing courts in New York City, posing risks to housing security of many tenants now that the moratorium has expired. Looking more narrowly at the universe of city shelters, we know that the rate of families with children entering shelter within 12 months of exiting has dropped to 4% over the last few years. and rental subsidies have proven instrumental in maintaining permanent housing. We look, the rate of reentry is only 1% for families with children exiting shelter with a housing subsidy, and it is 16% for exiting shelter without the housing subsidy. Again, this is an example of how when we invest in families, we invest in society as a whole. Each year, and in this data book, we analyze multiple sources of data to identify both barriers and opportunities for well-being that families face. What we learn from this analysis is how children and families in some areas of the city are more likely to experience barriers to well-being compared to children and families in other areas. The population of children in communities where there are fewer barriers to well-being are majority white, and children in communities where there are the greatest barriers are majority or black. These racial and ethnic disparities are not inherent differences between groups, but stem from disinvestment and discrimination over decades. To chart a path toward investing in communities, our latest report uses a strength-based approach to counter risk-based and deficit-focused narratives about New York City's children, families, and communities. Part of this approach relies on mapping community resources that are important for all families to have access to. Right. We draw attention to essential community infrastructures such as banks, grocery stores, healthcare facilities, parks, to uncover where in the city there exists a network of support for families, as well as where greater investments are needed. And new in this edition of the data book is an asset map for all 59 community districts as part of our geographic profile. So if you are interested in a particular neighborhood of the city, you will find a summary of data for your community. Investing in community infrastructure that helps families thrive is a critical component of the roadmap to resilience and an equitable recovery from the pandemic. Other critical investments include lifting families' incomes through a variety of economic programs, including direct payments, stabilizing housing through both legislative and executive actions, and budgetary decision-making, reconnecting families to childcare, education, and services, and addressing the behavioral health crisis of the elderly. Based on the council's response to the fiscal year 23 executive budget, we know that members of City Council share these goals. There is a lot of information in the data book, and it serves as a desk reference to complement our interactive online database, data.ccc.org. We also provide there hundreds of indicators that we invite you to explore, download, match, and share with others. On behalf of CCC, I invite you to explore both the publication and the online database and reach out to us if you have any questions or ideas. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. Thank you for sharing in our mission of the city. We're excited to continue the conversation with you all and take action to ensure every child in New York is healthy, housed, educated, and safe.
So clearly the data paints a stark picture from NBC. Those sobering experiences by children and students across the city, and it's clearly a critical moment for New York City government leaders to negotiate an adopted budget for 2023 that positively informs the pace of recovery, the path to resiliency, and ensures that together we build a more equitable city for all New York City children, families, and communities. And we're incredibly fortunate this morning to have several champions from the City Council joining us today, and I know you all look forward to hearing from them. So I'm going to introduce each of them briefly before I engage in a conversation with them, and then we're going to open up the floor for questions. So I'll introduce all of you. So I will start closest to me. Our first panelist is Councilmember Rita, the new chair of the Council Committee on Mental Health. And Councilmember Lee represents the 23rd Council District in Eastern Queens. Prior to taking office, Councilmember Lee was president and CEO of Korean Community Services of Metropolitan New York, which spearheaded the creation of the first state licensed mental health clinic serving Korean Americans, the Korean American community. And next to Councilmember Lee is Councilmember Rita Joseph, who serves as the new chair of the Council for Human Education, and she represents Council District 40, serving areas of Flatbush, Prospect, Buckley's Park, Kensington, Dix Park, and Southern Crown Heights. Prior to being elected to the City Council, Councilwoman Joseph was a public school teacher at PS6 in Brooklyn, as well as a community activist who served on both the Neighborhood Advisory Board and the citywide participatory budgeting committee. Next, we have Councilmember Althea Stevens. She is the chair of the Youth Service Committee and represents Council District 16 in the Bronx, which covers Claremont Concourse, Concourse Village, Hybrid, Morris Heights, Mount Eden, and Morsania. The council member worked for 15 years in nonprofit agencies and community centers as a community organizer and youth services program administrator, including serving as a department director of elementary programs and community affairs at Eastside House Settlement in the South Bronx. And last but not least, we are joined by Councilmember Tiffany Cabán, who is the chair of the Council Committee on Women and Gender Equity. She represents District 22, representing several police communities, including Victoria, parts of Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, and Woodside. The council member was a public defender at the New York County Defender Services and the Legal Aid Society's criminal defense practice prior to becoming a council member. So I am really thrilled that all of you are here. I know you're incredibly busy, and I'm really interested in digging into a great conversation today. As we heard from Bijan, the pandemic obviously touched every facet of child and family life. And in the next 20 minutes, I'm going to try to elevate with you specific issues raised in the data book and tie it back to the budget priorities that you've identified. So I'm going to start with you, Councilmember Lee. Turning to the topic of behavioral health, the data reveals that New York children and youth really faced a mental health crisis prior to the pandemic, with rising suicide rates of over 30% in the last decade. And we know too that the data revealed widespread illness and loss of life and really a dramatic impact on the life of children as they lost caregivers. And so we're in this situation where we have really skyrocketing behavioral health needs, and we knew before the pandemic there was incredibly limited access. So given what you know about the behavioral health needs of children and families, I wondered what your reaction might be to the mayor's executive budget.
Thank you so much for having us. I know. First, I'm glad to be here with all of you, and I actually feel like there's leaders in this room that know much more about this than I do, especially from the supplement process. So I appreciate all of you that I know that are sitting here and doing this work in the community. And I said this actually during our press conference that we had in the Capitol, which is that we all knew that mental health services and funding for mental health services was way underfunded before the pandemic started, and it just wasn't prioritized. I think there were efforts made to thrive, but to be honest, I don't think it was enough, and I don't think enough of that funding went to the actual community groups that were serving the folks on the ground. And so you have almost now this situation where I always like to see it in a positive spin, where there's an opportunity for us to really make a lot of positive changes and to really advocate on the mental health front. There alongside that, there's a lot of barriers as well. But I think for me personally, what I've seen in the community is that several things that were touched upon actually in the report is that well, I don't know how you guys are in your districts, but for me, I actually have 35 public schools in my district and then 13 private schools on top of that, and I've really been making an effort to visit every school. And consistently what all the principals and administrators in the schools are talking about is the social status of the kids now that they're all coming back. And we're seeing it play out in a lot of different ways with increased maybe incidences happening, children feeling anxious, more depressed. I know that there's loss of learning, but that's across the board. And so that's not something that is individual to a specific student, but that's something that we're seeing across the board. But I think what we need to do, which all of us here understand, is that we need to double down on a lot of the social service programs, because I do think that the after-school compass programs like Althea ran in her days in youth are so crucial and complementary to what we're seeing in the schools. And we all know that, it's great that we have funding now for social workers in the schools, but it's just not nearly enough. And oftentimes it's just one social worker or one behavioral health counselor, and that is not nearly enough to address all the students that are actually in the building. And so that's something that we really need to push for, is how are we going to look at the budget in a way where it is really actually putting dollars and resources into programs that make a difference. And I think the other issue that we're facing at the city is not necessarily around budget per se, but it really is about how our city agencies are so siloed. Even in the reporting that we have to do, there's a lack of communication that's happening between city agencies. And so even if you just look at mental health in general, you have parts of mental health that are under DOH&H, other parts that are under H&H, and then there's some under DYCD, some under Department of Homeland Services and EMS. But how are all of these agencies communicating with each other, and how am I, as someone coming and entering into the mental health system and continuum, there's so many places where I could fall off, right? And so we have to figure out a way where there's a way to track, but also keep city agencies accountable for where your responsibility ends and where the handoff happens, and making sure that those folks are actually getting services that they need. Because I think in the mental health sector, we've seen that happen way too often. And then also just making sure that that $14.1 million investment to hire social workers, like I mentioned before, I think it's great, because we need to also think about the District 79 schools, the District 75 schools, because they have more of a need. And so how are we going to support that student body as well? And other issues which I'll go into later, but that's a whole there.
Thank you. And we look forward to working with you to also try to figure out, as we build a continuum, how do we make sure that we're actually shoring up clinical capacity in communities as well as schools at the same time, so we don't have this pendulum that swings between those two systems, because kids need access everywhere. So I'm going to turn to Council Member Joseph on the topic of early education and K-12 education. The pandemic clearly impacted both ends of the educational continuum, childcare and UPK, as well as K-12 education. We saw in some of the slides that there was a dramatic decline in the height of the pandemic, and the number of children enrolled in childcare early education. So many women were pushed out of work because of childcare needs, and there's been a disproportionate number of students of color that have missed out on school altogether when we were in a remote school environment. And clearly these factors exacerbate education inequity. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what your reaction is to the early education K-12 proposals in the executive budget, and what particularly you would like to see in an adopted budget if you had your wish list.
Good morning, everyone. Councilmember Joseph, Chair of Education. Thank you for that question. I'd love to see some investment all around supportive services for students in public schools. Especially, that's one of the things I fought a lot for with this budget, is a political campaign, especially with special education students with with the pay parities. After we retain and keep the time, keep pulling in away from the resources, and these CEOs are being taken out. So that was one of the things that we baseline into this budget. $30 million to make sure the pay parities would equal the playing fields to keep these smaller CBOs functioning, because they help a parent go to work, especially mothers. And as we kept on to meeting in the report, it's more moms that are affected than any other household. So we have to make sure it's important. K-12, make sure they have mental health, but not just to say mental health. I'm training to go along with these kinds of social work. I'm on the ground at business schools every day. A lot of them are not doing professional development. Social learning, social emotional learning has to connect with what's happening. You can't disconnect. And that's one of the things my colleagues are not talking about. Providers are not talking to agencies are not talking to each other. So when I drop off someone here, when Althea picks that person up, there should be a conversation. There should be a connection. And what we're finding on the ground, even as we talk for summarizing, for example, there's disconnects between summarizing and the provider. Because the DOE comes here, drop them off at the providers and it's in the store. So we want to make sure, as Linda mentioned, before, that everyone is talking. This work to be done. Right? Every one of us have to be in communication with each other and pass it on to
I wondered if you want to lean in a little bit to the special populations, what you're doing.
Definitely. I have a week list in my practice to students of foster care. And when I came into the system, looking at how foster students are treated, there was no set person in the DOE to talk to them, to welcome them, to set them in the right places. And if I wasn't an educator, because we wasn't a nurse, we didn't have the means, we would be stuck without transportation, without a transition person. There's no transportation. They're giving 6-year-old metro cards. And I had to hearing about that just the other day. And I asked the DOE as an educator, how would you rate yourself? Approaching standards mean I'm a number 2, close to a 1. And that's what they told me. They owned it, but now they need to start making changes. My students are in a temporary housing. There's no coordinators to be that liaison between the schools, the community, and my students. So I'm championing for that. I just sent out a letter to the chancellor to make sure that they're using some of the American Rescue funds to hire coordinators for students in housing. Our students in foster care, this was baseline before this administration, for the students in foster care, and yet they have not hired staff to work with our students in foster care. Honestly. So I have this whole budget.
We look forward to rallying and everything.
Of course.
So I'm going to turn to Councilmember Stevens and the topic of the youth services. The data reveals that while New York's youth unemployment rate had improved in the years prior to 2020, the barriers to youth employment have clearly worsened during the pandemic. The data shows that about 62% of youth 18 to 24 lost employment since March 2020. And the pandemic also revealed, at the height of the pandemic, dramatic declining enrollment in after-school youth services, followed then by an ambitious summer, rising summer. So I wondered what your reaction is to the mayor's summer youth employment and summer rising proposals, and if they've gone far enough, and really what you would like to see prioritized in the adopted budget that you're pushing.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I'm Althea. I know most of you, either I met with you, I've known you before, or we've been in this journey for a long time. So I'm happy to be here and excited to be a part of this conversation and a part of this fight, right? I like to say that you guys got one and on the other side now. So it's time for us to really get to work. All of you know that we sat in meetings for years, just kind of talking, saying things that we want. And so right now, I mean, like I said, I almost met with most of you guys. It is time for us to go to the back to get what we want, and I'm ready to fight. And as you guys see, we have a really good team. So, so the summer rising and the summer youth, it's not enough. Like it's one of those things where it sounds nice, it sounds great. We have 100,000 jobs, and we're gonna have 110 students in summer rising. But I don't believe any of us asked for that. No one here asked for that. That's not what we asked for. And so it's once again not being heard and not being seen, and really trying to push to the forefront the things that we did ask for, right? So even when we talk about summer rising coming in, we're about to have pay inequities within agencies, within programs, within the same agencies. And that just does not make sense. And it's once again because they did not speak to us or talk to us. And so now I'm like, no, this does not make sense. So why are we doing it? And you need to fix it, right? And it's like, well, we didn't even think about that. We didn't have RFP come out. And I'm like, well, that's the problem. Yeah. So how are we fixing this? This does not make sense. When we talk about summer youth is great, but it's 6 weeks. That's it. And so like, why are we not investing in work, learn, grow? Like, why didn't we think about saying like, okay, we can invest in this and roll this out even better next summer? Because that's the other thing. There's no infrastructure. We know right now we are all struggling because this pandemic wipes us out. You know why? Because we're on the ground. When everyone was home, we were giving out food. We were watching children, setting up learning labs, just doing all the things. And so now we are all burnt out. And now you're saying again, let's increase the numbers for 6 weeks over the summer and pretty much like take us out completely. And by the way, we still haven't got paid from last summer. But that's so child. Trust me, guys, I am constantly fighting and yelling and bringing that up because I think it's so disrespectful
Always, yeah.
and inappropriate that the way they treat us around these contracts and just like, well, hasn't registered. Nah. Trust me, guys, I know. My chief of staff is a grant writer, so she knows all the woes. And so every time they try to tell us one thing, she's like, actually, that's not how that works. So there's no getting around us because I have built my team of youth developers and service providers because that's how much I am passionate about this work. Like, it's that important to me because I think that for so long we just have not been heard or listened to. And that's just not okay because we do the work, right? I say it a lot. We're in an abusive relationship with the government, and like we are like a battered wife because we have no choice but to like take what they're giving us. But at some point we have to say enough because this is not fair. So when we, like you said, we started out with SYP and summarizing. Thank you, but we didn't ask for it. And yes, we're gonna do it, and it's gonna be great. And the kids are they're gonna have a great summer and they're gonna learn. But I want to be clear, I am definitely pushing to say we need to make sure that we're listening to providers. We need to make sure that they need to be in these conversations when we're thinking about programs, when we're thinking about even introducing legislation. Have we talked with the educators? Because you guys are the ones that are on the ground that's gonna have to implement it, which is why I'm always saying it is not about the initiative, it's about the implementation. What does the work look like? How is this gonna look like in real time? Because I remember being in programming and being like, this does not make sense. Looking at RFP being like, how is this doable? This is dumb. Like, who thought of this? And I'm being this transparent because it is true, because it's such a disconnect. And so for me, it's like, how are we bridging this gap to really make sure that you guys are being heard and making sure that we are doing this together? Because without us, it's like, without you guys, there's no us. You make us look good. The work that we talk about when we're talking about all this stuff, it is your work we're talking about, right? So for me, it's important for us to make sure that you guys are brought to this conversation and listened to and respect in a very different way. So the budget did not do enough. And I'm going to try to make sure that the things that we want are in there, like expanding Work, Learn, Grow, increasing beds for homeless youth throughout the city, because I don't understand how we only have 60 beds for older youth services, and they keep telling me that they're not even full. I'm like, this does not make sense. And so there's just a lot of things that I'm being told that I know isn't true because I've been there, and things that just are not making sense. And also too, like, how are we doing this work together, right? I think Linda, Councilmember Lee said it best, where not only within the government we don't communicate together, but even throughout providers, right? Like, how are we working together and really putting together best practices and not really chasing the money, right? Because a lot of times, anytime a new administration comes, we're all struggling to now say, let's change our strategic plan to fit what the administration wants. But how are we thinking about, how are we forcing the administration to come in looking at our strategic plans to create the initiatives? Because right now it's backwards and it doesn't make sense. And so you guys are always scrambling, but the reality situation is, you know what we need, you know what the city deserves. So why are we not coming to you saying, okay, what's going on in the community, what's going on the ground, and then looking at that and then really dictating to us what those initiatives are. So it's gonna take some time and some work, but as you guys know, we have a majority women council. Passion, which means we listen, we take everything into consideration, and so we're gonna get it done. I'm very positive.
I'm gonna shout out to my campaign for children colleagues who want to work more. So, Councilmember Cabán, we're going to turn to the last topic before we open it up to the floor, and we're focused with you on a conversation around economic and housing security. And Bishan's slide really revealed that after a decade of growth in the income among families and children, the pandemic, as we know, triggered an unprecedented spike in unemployment and income losses that have disproportionately impacted not only low-income households, but female-headed households and women of color in particular. And so sobering are the economic impacts of the pandemic that they really do threaten to set back years of progress on workforce gender equity. And the last thing I would say before asking you a few questions is, we know too, obviously, that economic insecurity impacts housing stability. And we've seen a family shelter system in the city that is disproportionately serving women and children of color, and lengths of stay are growing to 35 520 days. So I wonder both if you might react to the mayor's budget and call out whether or not you think it goes far enough to advance economic mobility and housing security, and then if you want to lean in on specific things that you're prioritizing with your peers in the preliminary budget this month.
Thank you. Althea brought that, you're saying.
Yeah. I know.
I just want to thank you for having me and for being able to share space, and thank all of you for the work that you do. And before getting into sort of the specifics, I like to at least try to kind of step back a little bit and place it within a wider framework, right? I mean, the short answer is no, the budget's not good enough. But, I think that there is, and this is something that everybody touched on, is that there is a real problem with both scale and culture, right? Because we are implementing a lot of these pieces, but not to the scale of the size of the problem. And that creates an environment where then when we, and my language, when we half-ass it, we don't get the kinds of results that we know we can have, right? That is shown empirically by evidence and data and science and research. And then they'll come back to us and say, well, this didn't work good enough. So well, you didn't give us what we needed, right? So we didn't actually get to do the thing. And then culture, I think, we have had in government decades over decades of a culture of social control, order, and discipline, right? Which is fundamentally different than what I think, especially this moment calls for in the midst of a pandemic and trying to recover from an ongoing pandemic, where we could be, and this is where we learn from women and families and children, is that we should be coming with flexibility, care, support, and self-determination, right? And so when we look at a budget, at this point where we know that there's an economic crisis, we know that there's a housing crisis, no, it's not good enough that homeless services is being cut by 500 million, right? That's 17%. We're looking at similar cuts across the board in relevant areas, and then not enough investment in housing, and then taking these approaches that aren't going to get us where we need to be. So, when I think about workforce and economic insecurity and the instability of this moment, we actually put out a report from the Comptroller's office, my office, and Councilmember Shahana Hanif's office on a feminist recovery, but it really honed in on sort of the gendered impacts of the pandemic, and no surprise to anybody in this room, but the same folks that have already been disparately impacted, particularly low-income, undocumented, BIPOC, queer, women with disabilities, and then yes, women-headed households were the ones that were experiencing the harshest economic and social dislocation, right? And so how, as a broad answer, how do we address that? A care economy. And I will put out that I've never had an original thought in my life. That N.K. Jemisin put forth the most beautiful definition of a care economy that I have ever heard in, I think, the short story is Those Who Stayed, right? I think that's the title. But anyway, I'm going to paraphrase, but she talks about how the work of a city or government is not to produce the widgets or the thing that the people need, but to support the workers who do that work, right? And so when we look at the workers who do that work, who support children, who keep families together, it is our human service workforce, which doesn't get paid enough, doesn't get the kind of support that they need. And so also what we laid out in sort of these 12 steps that we said should be taken, among them were expanded access to affordable childcare, flexible scheduling policies, a massive increase in the COLA for human service workforce, increasing the access to a range of benefits. So saying, well, we should be funding affordable benefits that workers can carry from employment to employment so that there's that stability there. And then, doing things like fully funding the city preps program, increasing housing stock, and then coupling it with legislative solutions, right? So for just as an example, some of the legislation that we have introduced includes removing a barrier of the current barrier of the city preps program, which currently the vouchers have to include a utility allowance, which is horrific because it lessens the housing stock that's available to folks. And then you're trying to find an apartment, you think you found one, and you're like, actually, I'm $100 short, I'm $150 short, because people don't know this. And so I just think about also trying to find an apartment as a privileged person. I was like, at the time I had 2 dogs, I can't find an apartment. Imagine the sort of emotional turmoil of being somebody who is actively experiencing homelessness, trying to get out of the shelter system long term, and feeling like you're this close to having a home and then it's like you can't get it, right? So lifting that barrier and then also fully funding. The same to make sure that we have pots of grant money available to folks. So introduce the Survivor Stability Fund, right? Something that would take survivors of intimate partner, gender-based domestic violence and issue emergency grants to house, to take care of all kinds of expenses like safety planning, cell phones, childcare, all of those different things. And so I think the response to what we can do here is really funding, the stability and then economic opportunities for folks. But then like on the most basic level, just putting money in people's hands.
You're really a fierce group of women. I'm so pleased that you're here. I'm gonna turn to the audience, and if people have questions, raise your hand and I'll call on you, and you should introduce yourself and then direct your question to someone if you can. And I'll try to facilitate.
We're a loud bunch.
I know you guys are not shrinking violence, so someone must have a question.
Hi, I'm Sam Valley. I'm from Live on Next Gen Politics. Firstly, I just want to thank you all for the work that you're doing. Councilmember Claus said, bringing the fire and bringing the energy. And in that vein, I'd like to hear your thoughts about how young people can be involved in sort of addressing these challenges. And as you know, it is a very complicated way of addressing some of the health challenges to give young people a sense of identity, agency, and they have more time and energy than many of the understandably burnt out adults in their lives. So just love to hear some concrete strategies for getting young people involved in tackling these issues.
I don't mind going first. I mean, so literally the only reason I ran is because young people told me to, and literally I did it because they told me to, and I wanted to inspire them and get them involved in government. That's my whole entire story. I mean, most of you guys have met with me. I've told you guys the story already, so I'll spare you those details. But for me, it's always like, how are we making sure that young people are part of this conversation? Because when I was having the conversation with young people, they said the reason that they are not involved in government because no one ever asked them to be. No one's ever asked them to vote. No one's ever asked them to be on a campaign. And so I was just like, well, I'm asking you. And I did. And I remember being at a training, they were asking like, who's your base? And I said, young people. They said, you're gonna lose because young people don't vote. And then I said, no, young people are not inspired to vote, which is a difference. And so for me, I have a youth advisory council where we are literally trying to recruit young kids to pretty much be my ear and let me know, because although I feel young, please don't. And I really truly believe that anything that I'm pushing, I feel like I should be getting their approval or their still or their voice should be heard. And they really just don't believe me because they're like, man, she really don't listen to us. I'm like, yes, I listen to young people all the time. We know nothing, like you guys are the ones. And then even telling them like, a lot of talk is about you guys are the future and those things. And it's like, you're not the future, you are the present. Like it's right now, your time is now. It's not in 10 years, it's not in 5 years. The work that I am doing is for you. If we are not doing this for young people, what are we doing it for? So I'm trying to really change the mindset of young people and just get them involved. So young people, when I see them, I'm talking to them, I'm like, hey, so you want to come to volunteer? What do you want to do? Do you need an internship? I'm writing recommendations all the time. In my office, like we're always just trying to recruit them. And I also meet them where they're at. Like I talk to kids on the street all the time. I've visited a lot of your sites already, and I'm going to continue to visit even out of my district because I think it's important that we're talking to young people and they see us and they have access to us. I had a young person tell me like, I've never had a politician approach me. And I said, that's because I'm not a politician, I'm a youth developer.
Back on Councilman Stevens, when I ran, I told my students they could not vote because I teach in elementary, but I'm going to be their voice. So they followed me throughout the campaign. So once I got elected, once a month, I meet with young people. I said, bring your issues to the table. Testify at the hearings. Let them hear what you have to say. Because if I'm here on your behalf, I want to hear from you. My office is open for internships as well. advice, recommendations, jobs. If they're looking for jobs, I recommend. If I find out any internship opportunities, I'm shooting them out to the schools. I'm meeting with students. I visit two schools a week to make sure I'm meeting with young people. I want to hear their concerns. I'm going to be your voice, but I have to hear from you as well. So this summer, one of the things Councilmember Stevens made us promise. All of us will be going to Summer Youth. Yes. Ooh, I already started. I'm having 4.
Yeah, just to add on to that as well, is that, we know that New York City is one of the most diverse cities ever with a ton of languages that are spoken. And what I've seen in working in the Asian community is that there is a huge disconnect between why it's important to vote, especially in your local elections, and what is the connection. And I think it's both parents and youth, right? And so it's interesting because something that we decided to do when I was at KCS is that we had a summer youth program. And one of the things we did was actually include the civic engagement component into the curriculum because that wasn't there before. It was just more volunteer service, which is important. But we really wanted to educate the youth in terms of why is it important for you to get involved in your, local civic or, in your student government, right? Because even in your schools, like there's student government, there's ways to get involved, there's ways to take leadership. And why is it important to have that voice and advocate and speak up? Because I gotta say, when I was growing up, it wasn't social work or being in the public sector was never a conversation with my family because that just wasn't. Our families were newer immigrants, they were in survival mode, had small businesses, and they weren't really thinking that. But I think now we're in a position where, in our generation and with my kids too, who are 7 and 3, I'm trying to. They begrudgingly come with me a lot of times to these events in the community. They're like, "Mommy, why are you dragging us to this thing?" But I think it's important for them to see at a very young age, right? Like just that act of being involved in your community, like I have to model that, and so I think that's also important too. And the language access piece, which I know you're very big on as well, is so hugely important. And how do we make sure that every community is getting outreach to, which can be difficult when you're not from that culture, don't speak the language. So I think that's why we need to keep expanding on that.
Can I briefly add without reiterating, I'll be super brief, but like we all the time say that the people closest to an issue or problem are the people best situated to ideate solutions, and I don't know why, but like out of the expanse of all of the population demographics, whatever, we never talk about children in as part of that. And so I think the key is just treating children as valuable and as important a contributing member to this work that we do as any other demographic, because they are willing, able, and equipped to do it. On my campaign, our Green New Deal for New York City, which is this really in-depth policy platform, 30 pages long, was co-written by youth climate organizers, right? Like letting them lead that work, but then also understanding that it takes a lot of forms, and so the way that we can support children is not just by listening to them, but actually investing in putting tools in their toolbox so that they understand the strategies to engage in to kind of create political pressure, to do organizing, because they can and will do it with a lot of incredible skill. I've seen it, we've seen it with a lot of the different campaigns. And then also, I don't know about other folks in here in the room, but like, I personally support lowering the voting age.
Agreed.
From 18 to 16. I think that's really important. Our young people, they are smart as heck. They have, I just am continually amazed. I talk to them like, wow, there's a clear theory of change here. There's like just a beautiful framework, and also just the creativity that sometimes we struggle to access because of the years of life we've spent living on this earth. It seems like farther and farther away, but it's just like a beautiful thing to be able to tap into. And so yeah, to your point, it's like now.
Yeah. And I would add, before I grab someone else's question, we run a youth action program, and as do many of our peers. And in the last year, we had the opportunity to be the first citywide youth survey designed by youth, led by youth. And in a 3-month period, they reached 1,600 young people in the city of New York. It was an incredibly diverse, distributed population across the Black boroughs. And I know some of our council members were at the release of that platform, but
These
it
kids
is,
are amazing, by the way.
but it was
I
clear
was
that
like
if
amazed.
you give youth an opportunity, they take it. And so we need to create more opportunities there. I'm gonna call on Michelle.
I can probably do without the, okay, do it.
We're probably gonna say the same.
Sorry. Go ahead, I'll do it.
Okay, sorry.
All right, good morning. I'm Melissa Ossie. I'm the CEO of University Settlement. Thank you so much, CCC. This is always an amazing reveal when the report comes out. I want to thank the council members for your clear support of Human Service COLA in your version of the budget. I have to go beyond disappointment to infuriated that the mayor did not include that in the executive budget. And I want to know your thoughts about the best strategy. I assume you're all committed to the fight for this. It undergirds every single thing you've been talking about and every single aspect of human service. And our teams are exhausted. And to not be able to give them a COLA after so many years is just, it's a kick in the gut. We're gonna lose them all, right? We're gonna lose the network of New Yorkers who help New Yorkers. And so I wanna hear like your thoughts about the best strategies for this fight, because we are gonna be fighting. And I assume we're gonna be fighting alongside.
Remember that the budget that came out is preliminaries and executive budget, so we're still fighting.
Yes,
And we're in the rooms, we're in our rooms, our sleeves are rolled up. If you have to take off some earrings. So it's still negotiable, back and forth. We put in, we take out, they put in, we take out, we fight, we say no, we move it here. So it's ongoing. We have until July 1st, and we're doing budget hearings too. So you will be hearing from us, fighting alongside.
It's going to be recognizing that the budget fight is one fight, and so partnering with coalitions that have other budget demands that are values aligned, right? Because then it takes your large coalition and makes it that much larger. Because quite honestly, you can identify sort of like a common target or, yeah, I think common target is the right word for it. And I'm going to use, an example, but when we talk about human service workers, we are talking about care economy, we are talking about fully funding public health infrastructure. And when you name it in that broad sense, there are a lot of other coalitions that are fighting for pieces of that like very intertwined pie. They're all as important. They all must be and be understood as being in relationship to one another. And so, the example ever and that is very on brand for me that everybody knows that I love to give is that like we have what seems like an astronomical budget, right? Almost $100 billion, but it's also finite. And so if a dollar goes somewhere, it can't go somewhere else. And when I think about that paradigm shift away from social control, order, and discipline to one that's caring, supportive, the one that allows that self-determination and is resource rich, right? The one that is centered around abundance, then we have to be thinking about the fact that the NYPD is ready to blow their overtime by $700 million already. The fiscal year's not over. And all of these other pieces, how much is it costing us to effectuate these homeless sweeps that actually aren't having the intended impact? When we talk about impacts, and then how much would it cost to just simply house people instead, right? And saying like, people having those fights, that's our fight, and they're having those fights, well, this fight is their fight too, and connecting in that way.
And I think something on, now that we're sort of at the, as Althea said, we're on the other side and we were on your side in terms of like understanding the struggles with the budget contracts, the lack of COLAs, the lack of consistent percentage of COLAs. I don't know, like when you were talking, I just kept thinking like, no more freaking like unfunded mandates and all these things where it's like you're expecting us to do more, but you're not giving more resources for it. And I think it just, I think that's a piece that we have to try to figure out also on the back end, like how are we gonna have some of those conversations, and then also on the outside have that very public fight, right? Which I hate to say it, but there's power in numbers, on the steps, and there's also negative pressure and press that certain people in government don't like, right? So I mean that all can be impactful and can help us on the back end to sort of push and say this is like, it has to be a multi-pronged approach, but
I was gonna say, just keep the pressure on. First of all, that rally was amazing, right? Because I think for so long, people just did not realize, I always knew that. I said it, I knew we had this in us, but we have to keep that pressure on because it's that important. I'm having a budget hearing on, I think it's Monday. Yeah, May 9th. It's not great.
Mine is
Monday. Everyone should, listen, I don't wanna have to sit there for 10 hours, but if we gotta sit there for 10 hours, then we should. And I think it's important because I was actually gonna email Nora today to just say that I need folks to show up and be on point around what we really want. Because a lot of times at my hearings, I get people asking for discretionary acts. No, that's not what we're asking for, because this is the big budget and overall what we need. So I need everyone to be on point around what it, because trust me, I'm in these rooms screaming to the top of my lungs talking about this stuff. But then everyone comes and they're like, oh, we're doing this program, it'll be great. I'm like, you just met with me and told me this. That is not what we need to talk about in this moment. So we need to keep the pressure on, we need to organize, like whatever we need, like we need to keep it going. Like they said, some people, they don't like negative press. They don't like those things. We should be writing op-eds about it. We need to be marching. We need to be on those steps. We need like a lot of you have lobbyists. I don't know why, but put them to work. Like that's what they should be doing. They should be at City Hall at every state, like other lobbyists are, lobbying these electeds and letting them know, like put them to work. I'm also working on legislation around procurement and doing some stuff around baselining wages in the human services. So I'm working on that. And when I introduce it, I'm gonna need you guys to keep the pressure on. I was saying like, no, we need this. I need this to be heard. I need this to be in a hearing because my voice is good, but there's so many more of you guys that really can keep this. But we just gotta keep the pressure on and like continue to show up, continue to be there. And like I said, everyone should be testifying on Monday. Every organization should be talking about how outraged they are. You should have children on there talking about it because it affects them. Right, and all these things and being on point and making sure that we are all in line and showing up at everybody's hearing, saying the same thing, not just my hearing because it's great, show up at mine, but show up at all of the hearings, all of them. I have people who show up at my hearing, I'm like, what? I don't think this is me, but all right.
I'll listen anyway.
But we have to be there, but being there and being a nuisance and being heard, because unfortunately the squeaky wheel gets heard. And so we need to continue to be squeaky because I am sick of this fight because we've been doing it for too long. I mean, I said it, I used to be on these steps out here for years, for the last 15 years, like enough, just give us our money.
I also just want to like name and honor that what we just ask everyone to engage in is exhausting. It's physically exhausting, it's emotionally exhausting. You're doing the work and then we are asking you to have the energy to fight, to be able to continue to do the work. I just wanted to name and honor that.
Because you got all superheroes.
Thank you.
So Melissa, I actually did not have the same question, but I'm glad that you said what you had to say, and I just want to say, Councilwoman Lee, no more freaking unfunded mandates. And yes, Councilwoman Cabán, we are exhausted. I am a almost 30-year youth services advocate and provider, literally like 28 years on the steps, fighting for pretty much, I think, the exact same youth services dollars. It is such a privilege to see a fellow provider and advocate in your seat leading this committee, which I think I've testified before like 8 million times. I'm so glad you wanted to, but I don't think I could actually ever do that.
I struggle every day.
I am so excited about it. But you know as well as we do that youth development is education, it's health, it's family, it's community. This book is about young people all together as a holistic entity and within the context of their families and their communities. And the work that we as providers do is really to meet with young people and work with young people and families and communities holistically. I have to quote our Good Shepherd Services, I'm Michelle, Good Shepherd Services, our Good Shepherd Services board member, Lily Barrios Paoli, who always says, you know, young people come to us with what they want and we respond with what government has for them, right? And my question is, how can we finally work together to really have a holistic children's agenda, a children's budget that is allowing us to really provide holistically in response to what children, youth, and families want, and not just like what we do and we do very well, but it becomes harder and harder. is like paste those funding streams together with Scotch tape and Velcro, and then try to fill in the blanks, to try and actually provide what children and families are asking for. I know this is not an easy question to answer, but I'm really hoping that now with like this female leadership, and us working together with you, we can really shift this. And I just want to finally also say, I still don't understand why DYCD is separate from all the other human services.
Yeah.
agencies.
That's
all.
Like,
There's so many things that don't make sense.
Yeah.
Michelle.
Don't get me started.
I think as you answer her question, I'm gonna ask you to add in answering her question, what gives you hope? Because this is really
Yeah,
about
what
the
gives you hope?
future. So
I feel like Linda does a good job of talking about, because all I can articulate.
You already
is that
started.
the bureaucracy is wild. And that's like all I got, but you, in your earlier remarks, you talked about how like the infrastructure is such, there isn't good.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so yes, hope, yes, good. We'll end with this, but no, I mean, well, so first to address your question, I think as we're doing the budget dance, this is the time where if you guys have ideas for certain initiative funding, right, that is not currently, and I know that it may seem like it's sort of adding on top of more layers, but I'd be curious to see what funding streams we could sort of rejigger a little bit. And if there's initiative funding that is coming, I think the best policies come from the community, to be honest. And so if there's an opportunity for the human service groups and nonprofit sector to actually think through what would look like a good initiative funding to actually engage the youth more and to give them that opportunity to say, hey, this is what we want to give them and what we want to do. I think there's a window of opportunity right now. It's very short, but it's there. So I would encourage all of you guys to come to us with those ideas, and then we can throw them out to the council, because this is where the dance happens right now. It's the next 6 weeks. But there is some opportunity there, I think, to talk about that stuff. So even if not this year, definitely next year there will be, even if it's too late this year, I think there's still opportunity. I'm hopeful because we have majority women. And the thing I love is that even amongst the 4 of us up here, we're not what you would say are traditional elected officials, meaning, and I think, and I say this all the time, that, I was listening to NPR, I think, before when I started my campaign, and it was talking about the research and looking into the difference between why women run and why men run, right? And no offense to the guys in the room. But usually for men, the reason why they run for office is for money, power, these traditional things, and status, right? But for women, it's because we see an issue in the community, we see something we want to change and see fixed, and that's why we decide to run, right? And so I think with all of our experiences here, working in the communities in all the different various ways, I think there's so much talent and new energy that's being brought into the city council. And whatever, I'll just say it, whatever our politics may be, one thing I respect about each and every person here is that we have the pragmatic side and sort of the understanding to know that we may not agree on all issues, but there's so much that we can agree on. And so how are we going to push those things forward and really come up with solutions that are pushing the needle? Because either way, we have to push the needle. We have to move it somewhere. And so I'm very thankful and appreciative because we've been able to really build great relationships, no matter what perspective we're coming from, which I think is hugely important. And for me personally, I think, on the whole side also is, I think we all have a lot of really great ideas. I don't want to get into it, but for me, I talked to you a little bit about it, but on the mental health side, insurance is a huge barrier, I think, in accessing care. And so how do we get the private sector involved in this conversation? Because it has to happen. It can't just be government. I think, when there are certain pieces that belong to the private sector. So how do we make sure that we keep them accountable as well in this whole grand scheme of things? And just thinking through working with our state partners on the mental health side, because the licensure, compliance, regulatory stuff sits at the state level. So how do we as a city pressure them to think more broadly and outside the box of who can deliver mental health services and what does that look like in schools, right? Do we need to have a social worker? Can we have paraprofessionals? Can we have, folks that are peer-to-peer, family? Because those things all work and it's evidence-based treatment. So I think we have to be more creative, especially when we're looking at a workforce shortage right now. And so you know, I think we have people in the council who can sort of have that, you know, we have that lived experience of going through this, and so how do we take those creative ideas that we've been talking about and actually turn it?
Sure. One of the things we talked about the budget, and one of the things Linda just said too, we have to also be creative. Think outside the box. This is a new day. But let's reimagine how we want young people to be treated in New York City. So this is our opportunity at the table, and when we bring new ideas, it doesn't have to be the old same things. We could bring new initiatives. So I would love to challenge to bring new initiatives for our young people working alongside with you. And what gives me hope is working with these amazing women. We show up for each other. And that's one of the things, this is a sisterhood. And when we walked in, we're like, they were read in 6 months that we would not get along. We're gonna prove them wrong. And that was the best. Since 6 months. And so far we're doing amazing. We show up for each other. I show up at every youth event. We call each other, we call agencies, we sit on meetings with each other to make sure that they're hearing us and to see that we have a tribe. We're not alone. When I roll up with my posse.
Gives me hope. So a few things give me hope. So young people always give me hope. Like that's the baseline. Like they give me hope. Like literally my team knows when I'm a little bit grumpy or grouchy. They set up an appointment for me to go to a school program. They're like, oh, because they know that kids need to pour into me. Because when I'm not around them for long periods of time, I get real grumpy and weird. And I'm like, oh, I need to see kids. Because I miss it. I do. Like I've been in buildings with kids for the last 20 years, and to not have that, it really messes with my soul. So kids give me hope. So guys, I want to announce now that I will be doing a SYEP tour and a summer rising tour and visiting as many summer camps as I can this summer. I'm gonna be dragging some of them along with me. They don't know that yet, but that is my goal, to visit and also get out to the providers. And like, I want to be camp counselors. Like, how often do they get to actually have access to us? And that to me is important. So yes, that gives me hope that I'm gonna have a summer with you guys out there in the field and making sure you guys are okay and checking in and holding people accountable in that way. So that gives me hope. You guys give me hope. That the showing that you guys had at that rally gave me so much hope and so much pride, and like it was all like my heart was so filled. So you guys give me hope. And like she said, the things that we're saying are exhausting, but guess what? You guys keep showing up, and we keep showing up because you love the community and each other and our people and humanity the same way I do. So that gives me hope because I'm not alone. And so I have a posse to fight with me. So in council, like Rita said, we like each other. Like really actually like each other. Like we call each other, we check in on each other, we like hang out, like we like each other. And so it's nice to have an environment of that. And then we know that we have people who are actually doing the work and doing good work on the human services side. So that just gives me so much hope to keep going and showing up every single day, although this job is very exhausting.
To answer the first
Yes.
question before, like some hope, I've been thinking about it as y'all were speaking, but you know, I think something that feels a little bit different is that in this council, you do have more organizers in the body, which is new in the electoral political space, and it has kind of like shifted sort of the traditional strategies that get used, and then we're seeing some interesting results from it. But I do think that there are more people that, because typically I think the status quo or the tradition has been to sort of like protect the reputation or the quote unquote integrity of the governmental institution at the expense of others, where you have folks coming in and saying, no, my role is to engage in an inside-outside strategy. And so I'm here to shed light. I'm here to share information and create pathways that expand the opportunities and capacity for outside organizing, understanding that it's an ecosystem, right? And so that I think is like one thing that we can and have started to do that can address some of the issues that were like the first part of that question that were presented. I think there are some folks that hear their flux about like who they piss off or I'm gonna speak truth to power. I'm gonna let people know, and that's gonna be my top priority. But even though we're all women, right? There's politics involved, and politics get shifted. It takes a little bit of political courage and all those things to get that done. But I think we have more political courage than we have seen in years past. And then the thing that gives me hope is sort of what, like building off of what Linda said, is like we're not all identical in our politics, but I think what makes this body different, that will naturally bring about some change that will ultimately benefit the folks who have been on the margins of the margins, is identity politics. And that is a term that has been like misdefined everywhere. It has been co-opted and misdefined. Like the original definition of identity politics, going back to when Barbara Smith and Columbia River Collective coined the term, was that we, at the intersection of our marginalized identities, must bring our whole selves into our politics, because it is, yeah, but like the idea being is that our identity, who we are, how we present to the world, has affected how we interact, and then and then what happens when we interact with governmental systems. And so we are then best situated to identify the problems and ideate the solutions. And so like identity matters, and what you're looking at is the most diverse body that we have ever seen in the council. So that gives me hope.
So colleagues, our audience members, for contributing to an important time of conversation today. We know that the budget conversations are just beginning. If you haven't already, I encourage you to sign up for a CCC action campaign and stay informed of opportunities to advocate with to advance our shared priorities. Over the next several weeks, we're going to be hosting a 3-part webinar series that looks closer at different parts of the data book, and apparently you can use the QR code on the screen and check out the flyers for that. Lastly, place to keep track, copy of keeping track on your chair. If you want more copies, just ping us. You know how to find us. There will also be an order form and registration page disseminated in our webinar series. So I just want to thank all of you, and I look forward to a good fight with all of you to ensure that we adopt a budget that advances equity for families.